Hello, this is BSJ, and this video is going to be a draft analysis on a few of the games that I've watched in the Starladder iLeague Invitational, which is the first LAN tournament played on the patch 7.06, and the purpose of this video is meant to serve as an introduction to the competitive meta and the basic impressions that I've had watching the first several series played on 7.06. I think what's important to note at the beginning of every patch is obviously everyone's learning their strategies, and this is competitive Dota. Obviously it's not pubs, but I do believe it's a trend that the competitive Dota strategies, what's good, what's popular, what works, kind of bleeds into the pub Dota. It usually takes a little while, kind of trickles down from the higher MMRs to the lower MMRs. It's just like any other game. What people see as successful is what they'll begin to emulate themselves. So what I believe is important to look at the start of every patch, and this is something I'm going to try to do in any relatively large patch, is the fact that these teams are obviously learning the patch just like us, and so they're going to be trying things that they think are good or things that they potentially think are good. And what's going to happen is, because these players are the best of the best, that one team is going to simply exploit the strategy of the other team based on each one's impressions of the initial patch. And what I mean by that is, one team's going to have an idea of something that may be good, and then it's either going to work or it's going to get immediately punished by the better team or a team that just had a better idea of the patch so far, and then things are going to quickly adjust. So the purpose of this video is to show you, I talked about my initial impressions of the patch, but it's to show you things that I saw that are immediately good or successful and how the meta is going to shift towards that, and things that were immediately punished that may still work in the patch, but they'll be much more situational, much more you'll have to maybe reveal that part of the strategy later on. Maybe more greedy lineups are going to be situational, meaning the team that grabs greedier isn't going to just win this patch. The team that just commits to greed can actually be punished. And that's something I talked about in my introduction to this patch video. I talked about how I believe that the games are going to end sooner. Combination of the deny mechanic, the extra creep in the mid lane, the less neutrals, all these things make the lanes much more snowbally. It makes the resources that you get heavily based on the lanes, and then the mid lane matchup snowballs even harder than before. And also the fact that the second Roche gives cheese. That's going to be shown in one of the games that I'm going to be talking about in this draft analysis. Makes it easier to push high ground, the lack of base shrines, all these things combined just really speed up the pace of the game. And that's going to be something we're going to talk about in this video, the speeding up of the pace, how that affects drafting, how that affects what you should think about in your pubs, itemization, hero picking, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our first draft, and it's going to be Team Liquid versus Faceless. And it may be arguable that Team Liquid's a better team than Faceless, and that's why they won. And that's something that I definitely take into account, but what I want to recognize is that Team Liquid has Croaky, one of the best captains in the world. And so when you're looking at the start of new patches, at least what I like to do is look at these kind of guys and just see how they dissect the patch, how they choose to approach the patch. So going into this first match versus Faceless, I think that if you watch Faceless enough, you know that they're a very greedy team. They pick a lot of farm-heavy cores on black and jabs, and even Ice 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 generally prioritizes Midas builds and farming for the late game. And in my opinion, the reason why I'm using this series as an example very quickly is that this is punishable this patch. I talked about that briefly, but this whole concept of greed into the late game, holding the high ground, is just not as plausible as it used to be. And so when you look at this, I talked about my initial impressions that lane supports that secure mid and the safe lane are going to be of the highest priority, as what I believe will be the case, and that's kind of what's occurred in this patch so far. A lot of Ogre Magi, a lot of Dazzle, a lot of Treant Protector, Warlock. Heroes like this are very popular. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I did predict this, and it's just because the lanes are so important, and that's just showing and what's occurring. So if you're a support player, if you're ever forced to support, heroes like this I think are going to be very heavily favored because they want to be able to help the mid lane because there's an extra creep, there's that much extra resources. So we've been seeing a lot of dual lane mids. So that's my first impression, is heroes that just enable their cores to do more. And so we're going to be looking at this entire draft from Liquid's perspective because they won. And we're going to now talk about my next point in this video for drafting as well as the meta shift. So last patch, we saw heroes that were much more greedy in the laning stage being the better option. It wasn't as much about drafting for the lanes. I made a drafting video that's in my coaching simulation course up on GameLeap, and a lot of that talked about first you should draft for the lanes and then draft for the game. And what I mean, just to clarify that one more time, is that drafting for the lanes means making sure you win your lanes, or at least win the correct lanes, having as many good matchups as possible. And then drafting for the game is like heroes that counter other heroes later on in the game. You know, Magnus gets countered by Axe later on in the game because you can call the RP once a target begins to wail on the RP stun targets. That's just an example. Slark counters Bristleback because of Silver Edge, plus he gets a lot of Essence Shift stacks, and Bristleback doesn't have a stun to lock him down with. And that's in the later stage of the game. These are just a couple examples of things that counter other things later on in the game. Last patch, since it was much greedier and the games usually went 40 minutes plus, it was much more important to draft towards the late game. Draft for counters that dealt in the late game. Obviously, what I mean by this is in the last patch, it's not like you could just ignore your lanes entirely. You had to draft a little bit for your lanes and then mostly for the late game. In this patch, it's the opposite. And that's my impression of the patch, is that it's most important to draft for good lane matchups. And then secondary concern is to draft for the late game, mid game matchups. Because teams are able to hit these timings where sometimes that bad matchup doesn't even occur, meaning that, you know, late game Slark counters Bristleback, which we're going to see in one of these drafts, that if it doesn't get to that point in the game, who cares, right? So the reason why I'm emphasizing that now is because Bristleback counters Slark in lane, and we're going to talk about that when we see that in the next draft. So in this draft, right off the bat, we're going to see Bristleback picked up early in the draft by Team Liquid, and we're also going to see that in the next game. And I talked about Bristleback potentially being a hero that's good this patch, and the reason why I said that is he snowballs really hard from the lane if he's secured a good start, which is something that anyone who picks Bristleback, I'm sure they're going to ensure is going to happen. And he's a hero that just groups up and fights early. Like, with a couple items, he's really strong. Last patch, you know, all you had to do was hold off one strong push, and suddenly you had all this space to farm. You'd be split pushing like crazy. This patch, it's much more difficult to actually hold off that first push. So a hero like Bristleback's much stronger. Heroes that look to group up earlier are just going to be stronger. We saw TNC applying Jakiro as a very effective way of winning games. He's just a support that promotes grouping and pushing towers. So this is a hero, Bristleback, that wasn't all that popular last patch. And right away, since Faceless revealed their two cores, Bristleback can lane pretty well against both these heroes. You know, Troll Warlord may have high armor, but Troll Warlord doesn't do enough damage in the early stages of the lane, so Bristleback can survive, where he's, you know, a very weak laner in the early stages, but he comes online really hard with just a few levels. So he's not really punished by these two heroes. So we're going to go ahead and get to, like, you know, we're not going to worry as much about the bans, and we're just going to focus on the picks. We could worry about the bans, but the picks are the main focus that I'm looking at. So another popular support that I've already been seeing that I believed at the start of the patch as well is Dazzle. Dazzle's just a hero that makes it, he enables your cores. And what I mean by that is he gives them the sustain. They don't have to ferry out extra tangos. They don't have to ferry out, or they don't have to worry about trading all that much because they can just be healed, and it really shifts in favor of your carries. So what we're seeing on the successful team here is supports that enable their cores. We're seeing Ogre Magi, which buffs him up with Bloodlust and makes for a strong laning stage, and Dazzle with the heals, as well as the split push. Something that is really important in a meta when you're trying to force objectives is having lane clear, lane push, being able to manipulate creep equilibrium. Something that we're going to be seeing a lot in these games as a prioritization, especially in the mid lane because of that extra melee creep. Heroes that clear the wave much faster are just going to be more popular, because if you're getting your tower pushed in early, that's just a huge deal on any lane. And so that makes Bristleback a good hero. That makes, you know, a hero that lets your cores dominate the lane, such as Ogre Magi. Dazzle's one of the best supports for wave clearing, wave pushing. One heal bomb basically brings your, you know, heals your creeps and then kills the entire enemy creep wave, or, you know, close to it. So then combined with Ursa. Ursa's a hero that I'm going to highlight. I'm actually going to do a game analysis on him that'll be talking about the patch as well as the hero itself. I believe Ursa's going to be a huge impact on this patch. I wasn't 100% sure when the patch came out how good Ursa was going to be, but from what I've seen so far, I believe Ursa is going to be one of the highest prioritized carries this patch, and that reason is he's just a lane dominator, and lanes are just so important this patch because of everything we've talked about. So Ursa's effect on the game, what I talk about in the Ursa course, is that he enables other heroes. So what you should see in these games is that a hero like that just applies so much lane pressure that it allows the other heroes to be successful. You have to deal with them, and in this case, he counters Abaddon in lane. Period. That's why he's picked. if you look at the rest of their draft, Troll's pretty good against Ursa. High armor can like bash him to death. Slardar has the stun and the amp, which, you know, Ursa can only remove once. And so like they have a pretty good lineup versus Ursa in terms of like the mid to late stages of the game. But Ursa counters Abaddon in lane, period. And is pretty decent against Troll in lane as well. So it's not like they can just switch up their lanes and put Troll top. So that's one of those things where they are at immediate lane advantage because they picked Ursa. And that's just that much more important in this patch. So we're going to move on to the last pick. Notice how they're banning wave clearer mids, SF on the side of Faceless and then TA on the side of Team Liquid. Two very strong wave clearing mids. And so what I mean by what Ursa does as an enabler is he allows for other heroes to have a better start because he requires more attention. He just creates space. Same idea with Bristleback. Once Bristleback gets a lot of items, like when I say a lot of items, I mean like one or two, like treads plus half of a mech or half of a, or just a vanguard, you know, like just a lot of early items, just little items that make him hard to bring down. Level 7 or 8 when he gets points in his passive, making it harder to bring him down. Max quills, so he does a ton of damage. He's a hero that if you want to kill him, you have to bring multiple heroes, period. You're not going to kill him solo with any hero. So heroes like that just create space. Ursa's the same way. So they have 2 space creators plus a Tinker. And Tinker's a hero that last patch, if you look at their lineup on Faceless, I watched this game and I thought, oh, Faceless won this game. This is the first game of the patch that I watched. And the reason why I thought Faceless won was, you know, Team Liquid has no way of dealing with Storm in the mid to late game, and Storm counters Tinker. So, you know, Ursa and Bristleback are kind of semi-cores, meaning they're not the focus of the lineup, it's Tinker, and then Storm counters Tinker late game, and they have nothing to deal with Storm. So they just win. That's kind of what I thought about this draft when I first watched it, because this is my first draft of the patch. But after watching the game, we're going to flash forward quickly into the game, and we're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. So right off the bat, something we're going to note is in this patch, we're going to talk about timings a lot. Last patch, timings weren't nearly as important. They still mattered. Every concept that is ever talked about in Dota matters. But every patch changes the rules, favors what matters more. It really is that simple. And what I mean by that is, so like in drafts, you worry about drafting for lanes and drafting for the games. That's the perfect example. But in some patches, drafting for the game is more important than drafting for the lane. In this patch, I think it's more important to draft for the lane. So in this patch, when we talked about Ursa and Bristle are enablers for the Tinker, that means that there's going to be a lot of focus put on by Liquid to win their mid lane. And they had the Ogre versus the Slardar support matchup. Ogre's the superior roaming, like fighting in lane support. That's what he does better. So that's why they chose to prioritize that. They picked Ursa 4th, which meant that like they had Ogre to secure the mid lane because they saw the Slardar pick, meaning they could just win that dual lane matchup, which we're going to be seeing a lot of dual lane mids because of the extra resources making the lane snowball much harder. And since they knew they could secure that, their choice was to put their timing on Tinker. All we need to do is have a strong Tinker and we'll win this game. That was their mindset. And it doesn't matter, you know, if Storm counters Tinker in the mid to late game, if we just spiral our Tinker out of control. Like if we just get Tinker way ahead of the Storm, it doesn't matter. So if you flash forward, you know, 7-8 minutes into the game because of this dual lane pressure put on the Storm, Tinker's a full 1,000 net worth ahead of him at just 7 minutes in. And that's just what Ursa does. Like Abaddon, a hero that's very strong at pressuring the safe lane, loses the matchup to Ursa. So the only way that Faceless is going to win their offlane is if they brought Slardar there. And if they bring Slardar there, Storm's going to get absolutely crushed in the mid lane. So by having Ursa, who's a hero that counters Abaddon, say they had a carry that was much more pressured by Abaddon, then maybe the Ogre would have to help the Ursa secure his lane. But Ursa's just a good matchup against Abaddon, so all they need is Dazzle. And Dazzle, securing the wave push for him, allows for push-pulls, and Dazzle also helps clear the big camp. So you're going to see that Dazzle's already level 4.5, and like he hasn't taken pretty much anything from the Ursa. I mean, 4.5 at 7 minutes may not be all that impressive, meaning like, oh, it's not some crazy level 6 timing, but has a level 6 Ursa who's second in net worth only to their mid laner, and he's basically winning the lane for the safe lane with only one support. And that's why Ursa, in my opinion, is going to be so powerful this patch, because he requires minimal help And if they ever try to combat you, you can just bring 3 heroes and you're almost always stronger. That's just the case with Ursa. And there are cases that are exceptions to that, but that's kind of the strength of a hero usually gauged, is how often is their strength viable and how rare is it exploited. Like, how often can it be exploited? So with Ursa, lane strength being such a big deal, and his lane strength being so hard to take advantage of, it is possible having a stronger tri-lane against an Ursa. But it makes a hero just that much more powerful when what they offers is powerful, and it's usually good. So what we're going to basically see is that Ursa goes for an early Vlad's, nice team fighting item. Bristleback goes, even though he dies once early, goes for Tread's Soul Ring for the mana sustain, and then he goes straight into the mech. They're just going early fighting items. And if you watch, they're going to take the base at less than 20 minutes into the game. So we're going to quickly fast forward to that. So what I mean by timings is it's really important in this patch to have heroes that synergize with when they come online. And recognizing that even though the enemy team can exploit your draft, that if you pick too greedily, you're just going to lose in this draft. Like in the last patch, it was basically impossible to push high ground prior to 25-30 minutes into the game. And even then it was difficult. But with the removal of this shrine, on both sides, on the side lanes, it makes it much more difficult in the early stage of the game to defend. And also with the addition of just this snowballing effect from the lanes. Look at the net worths of the heroes at this stage in the game is 16 minutes. Because the jungle is so poor for recovery, suddenly you have the top 3 out of 4 net worths are on the side of Team Liquid, and they have an Ursa who has an Aegis and just 1 item. He does have a Blink flying out to him, but he just has 1 item at the time of Vlad's, which helps them push. They have the mech on the Bristleback, and they have all the items they need. They don't really need anything else. They have the 3 cores, they have Blink Tinker, so he's able to push out lanes while they're doing this. Something I talked about was really important. If you're trying to secure objectives, it is important to have heroes that also push out lanes, because you don't want to get split pushed to the point where the enemy team's taking more objectives than you are. And suddenly with this first Aegis, they're just going to ram it down the throats of Faceless. They're just going to hit their buildings. That's all it takes. 1 Aegis, and suddenly, like, you know, 1 fight turns into racks in this patch. It's not like last patch where, you know, all you had to do was fend them away and they'll have to back off. There's no more shrine. They can't sustain. This shrine was deactivated, meaning it was on cooldown, and this shrine isn't there anymore. So suddenly they just lose a racks at 18 minutes. And that's something that we weren't seeing last patch, and it's something that we're going to be seeing this patch and really should be paying attention to. So that's the first game that I looked at from Liquid. We're going to move on to the second game from this exact same series, and we're going to talk about similar points and how they apply in a different draft setting. So this next game, which features an untraditional pick to say the least, features a mid-lane Earthshaker from Miracle. And I think, you know, one of the funniest things about this game was the casters were basically flaming Miracle for feeding in the mid lane. And while he was dying, they were down 4-0 on Earthshaker. And what I thought was so funny about that was, I'm pretty sure Team Liquid's winning this game, even though their Earthshaker's 0-4 and nobody else has died in the game. And even though the mid lane, as we would say, is so important. So this is something where this is Kuroki pretty much picking apart the draft of Faceless once again, and we're going to talk about what I mean by that. So we're going to go and flash forward through this draft and talk about the main points that I want to look at that features the changes in 7.06. So right off the bat, Team Liquid's going to pick Coddle Bristleback, and that's just something that it's a very traditional combo because of the Chakra Magic making Bristleback having no cooldown. It also gives him the mana to use 2, so he not only can use 2 in quick succession, but he also doesn't lose any mana from doing so, because the Chakra Magic gives him the 75 mana and quills only cost 35. So it just gives him that steroid for the early stages in the lane, something we talked about with a hero like Bristleback. Have to give him a good start, have to enable him to have that good start. So last game, it was through the course of having the mid lane Ogre pressuring the Storm. So last game, when you look at the timings, Storm was the important key factor, but he was set up in a lane against Tinker Ogre, so he wasn't able to have that good timing start, right? You have to recognize what cores on each team are going to have impact early, are going to snowball. That's what's really important. So when you have that Storm Spirit, who's the hero that needs to snowball, and suddenly he's dealing with an Ogre Magi Tinker, that's a problem. So last game, you know, that's why the outdraft on the side of Team Liquid was the way it was. So if you look at this game, we're going to look at the same thing. We're going to look at the cores of each team and think to ourselves, what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What heroes, are the timings of each team reliant on? And how does that match up with the other timings of the enemy team? So right off the bat, we see Bristleback already pretty much guaranteed a good start because he has a Coddle. And we know that Bristleback's going to be laning with Coddle. So most of the time, Bristleback goes to the offlane. So if we're looking at this draft from Team Liquid's perspective, we're pretty much assuming that they're going to be in a dual aggro. So with that, at least a dual aggro, potentially an aggro tri-lane. So right off the bat, they ban a hero that makes that scary, makes that something they don't want to necessarily deal with. They ban the Ogre, very threatening lane support that can fend off a tri-lane. Next, they ban out the Ember Spirit, a hero that they're not going to have the catch for, and they know they also don't want to deal with a heavy snowballing mid hero because they're putting a lot of their attention on the side lane. So then they go for the Tusk. So the problem with you when you look at something like a Bristleback Coddle lane is it has no kill threat. Yeah, it has quills for damage, but it doesn't have any catch, right? It doesn't have any lockdown to chase them. So they decide to have a roamer that threatens that potential. Goes along with that concept. You have a strong Bristleback, like he's going to be hard to mess with, and then now you have making him a threat. Not only is he hard to fend away, but now he's a threat offensively. So they're enabling the core with their 2 support picks. Something that's important in every patch, but in this patch specifically, very important to enable the cores in the laning stage. So then, Faceless, in my opinion, makes a big mistake. They're kind of stuck in the last patch, in my opinion. They do go for the Witch Doctor, kind of like a secondary option to fend off the aggro tri-lane, the nice sustain from the Voodoo Restoration, and also Cask to deal with Snowball multiple heroes in. But they only have Witch Doctor Nyx, so that's just generally not enough to fend off such a strong lane. In my opinion, Faceless could have maybe tried to give up that lane and focus more on the mid lane. Maybe pick a roamer that secures the mid lane and go from there. But instead, they try to protect their safe lane. And right then and there, if you think about from Team Liquid's perspective, this pick was game-winning, in my opinion. Something I actually said I thought Lone Druid might be good this patch because of the timing pushes. And it applies in this game as well. And if you think about what Team Liquid's looking at this game as, they think, okay, Faceless hasn't revealed any cores other than the Magnus. And we know that he's offlane. And we have an aggro dual lane, and we want the option to tri-lane. We need a solo safe laner, at least a hero that could potentially be solo safe lane, that matches up well against Mag. And that goes Lone Druid. And that's why I think Lone Druid's going to be good this patch. Because if you reveal your offlaner, and he is weak against Lone Druid, and you have set up for going potentially aggro with a hero like Bristleback, a hero that's just aggressive, Clockwork, a Bristleback, like heroes like that just, spend time messing with the enemy team. That's just going to enable heroes like Lone Druid that are good at solo winning their lane. Last patch, we saw Lone Druid obviously got nerfed like crazy. He was good at the beginning of 7.0. But in the previous patches, one thing that made him even worse as a conceptual hero, what made him really good at the beginning of 7.0 is that he's just a lane dominator. He wins his lane 1v1. Once he gets level 5, it's pretty much impossible to lane against him. He's just a space creator. He just applies a lot of pressure. And he's a hero that really can't be messed with in lane for the most part. He's just one of the strongest solo laning carries in the game. And that's why I think we're going to be seeing the return of Lone Druid. And not only is he like that, if you look at the later stages of the game, timing-wise, what I also talked about, very similar timing to Bristleback. Something that lines up really well. Last game we saw Ursa Vlad's into Aegis, lining up with the Bristleback push. In this game, you see a Bristleback who comes online really well with just a few items. And you see a Lone Druid who also comes, sieges towers with basically, in this game, you're going to see just a Radiance. They just push with a Radiance. And then you ask yourself, well, what's their timing? And how does that deal with Faceless this point in the draft? Faceless only core, and also one of their supports, Nyx and Magnus. Magnus is weak to pushes because he only has RP and, Shockwave's like a counter-pushing nuke, but it's, if RP's ever on cooldown, Magnus offers absolutely nothing for D-push. And same with Nyx Assassin, especially against a Lone Druid bear, these just don't offer anything to halt the Lone Druid's push. So not only is Lone Druid good for the lane, but he's also great in terms of how his timings line up with Magnus's timings. And so we're going to see, in my opinion, an even bigger mistake by Faceless. Not only do they try to secure their safe lane, but they then pick a safe laner that counters Bristle and Lone Druid later on in the game. Something that last patch would probably be good. honestly, because they just wouldn't lose the game fast enough, and Lone Druid and Bristleback would have a hard time dealing with the Slark Shadowblade later on in the game. They wouldn't be able to farm at all. Slark would be able to be independent because they lack a lot of catch on Team Liquid. And what you're going to see here is that Liquid is just going to push. And if you look at their bans, like, what's the only hero that goes mid that really just is 100% about shutting down push timings? There you go. Tinker, right there, banned out. Like, the whole idea of their draft in this patch is about timings and reaching them. And obviously timings have mattered in all patches, but last patch especially, it just wasn't feasible to end the game at a reasonable time unless you were winning so badly it just didn't matter what heroes you had. But in this patch, timings are going to be that much more important. And we're just going to see that. They go for the PA mid, and Team Liquid goes for an untraditional pick in the Earthshaker. So you have to ask yourself what Team Liquid lacks in their draft. And I literally said they just lack catch. I know they have counter initiation of Tusk in terms of like saving somebody, but they don't really have like punish for you going in. If Slark and PA, two heroes that are really heavy commitment heroes, like they go in and they're committed, they don't have punish in the form of damage and stuns. And there you go, last pick Earthshaker for the mid lane. And then you ask yourself, is this mid lane really that important to Team Liquid? Something I talked about at the beginning of the patch is that it's probably going to be important, but what are their timings based off of? And I've already talked about it. It's the Bristleback and Lone Druid lining up. And then on top of that, just to throw some, sugar on top, is to have the Coddleags to go with that big push. And so if they get that Radiance around the 20-minute mark, pretty standard stuff for Lone Druid, if they have that Coddleags during the daytime that hits at 24, that's just their timing. And so what ends up happening in this game is that Earthshaker feeds the mid lane. He goes 0-4 in like the first 8 minutes of the game. And, we can flash forward real quick to see it's 4-0. All 4 deaths are Earthshaker. He's not having that great of a game. But if you look at that at the same time, the reason why that's the case is because the enemy team can't win their safe lane. And they can't win their off lane because Lone Druid's just such a heavy favorite against Magnus, and Bristleback's such a heavy favorite against Slark in lane. For those who are wondering why, it's because he has Coddle to amp up his quills, and Slark has really low base armor. So that's kind of a matchup that favors the hero that can man up on the other. If Slark has a tri-lane and it's a solo Bristleback, yeah, sure, Slark is good against Bristle because he can kill him with the Essence Shift stacks. But if you have a Bristle that has help, and the Slark suddenly gets double quilled before he even goes in, that's just really hard to deal with. And if you look at the net worths, even though their Earthshaker's basically feeding, they have the top 2 net worths on the 2 heroes' timings that matter. That's all that matters this patch, is winning the lanes that you will need to win based on your timings, and then turning that into ending the game. We're going to fast forward to the 24-minute mark, which is exactly what I was talking about. Lone Druid Radiance, Bristleback Mech, plus maybe another item, in this case the Crimson Guard, plus Lone Druid, or plus Coddleaxe. And you're just going to see that Liquid just runs down mid. That's their strategy. Coddleaxe, Lone Druid Radiance, they have all their items they need, and they're just going to ram down mid. Because they recognize the weakness of the Faceless' draft, and they recognize the synergy of their timings, and suddenly you just can't fight into this much sustain with a Radiance Bear, 2 bears, and this Coddleaxe. They force out RP, which is unfortunate on one target, but when is he ever going to get a good RP? They have a bunch of ranged heroes. Coddle actually buys back in order to ensure this push because they realize how important it is. RP is wasted, meaning that it doesn't accomplish anything. And even though PA was top net worth at this moment, they don't care. It just doesn't matter. And while this may seem cheesy, they're capitalizing on the weaknesses of Faceless' draft. And this is something that happens a lot at the start of patches, is teams will go for strategies that will get heavily punished because they're still, either doing things that they did last patch, or they're trying new things for the new patch and they get heavily punished. And I think the pace of games overall will slow down. And what I mean by that is games aren't going to continue to end around 25, at least in my opinion. I think that these games are ending so early because people are getting punished strategically very heavily. Like in this case, what I'm talking about is Magnus being first rounded. I don't think you can do that anymore because this hero is so susceptible to getting early pushed. He's heavily reliant on, the split push and farm booster he gives to his 2 cores, and then having them get more farm than the enemy team. But if they don't have any time to do that, then Magnus really isn't that effective. And you're seeing here, this wasn't feasible last patch, and suddenly they're just going to frickin' end the game. at 25 minutes in. They take the racks, they have this timing push, and they're just going to end this game. And if you really look at the drafts, Liquid had that in mind the entire way. And they capitalized on the first pick mag. Everything about the Magnus, it's a core in the first pick, and they brutalized it. They just shut it down entirely, countered the entire concept of the hero in the lane and in the game. And hitting timings in this patch is just going to be that important. And the game just ends 25 minutes in. Doesn't matter how farm the PA is. Doesn't matter that Slark counters these heroes in the mid to late game. They simply win. Doesn't matter that their Earthshaker fed in the mid lane. All that matters is that their two core heroes had good starts and their timing push lined up together. Coddle Ags, Lone Druid Radiance, and the Bristle Mech plus Crimson Guard. So when we look at the draft, what's really great about Vegas Squadron's opening that I really like, and a hero that I also did not factor in, but I can see why he's so powerful, is Clockwork. So if you look at Crystal Maiden, I said that she was probably going to be weaker, but I'm now realizing that if teams use her to bolster the carries like they have in the past, play her more lane supporty. Like, you don't just jungle her to give your team an aura, you also lane support with her and combo that with a bit of jungling to get levels. And then she's going to be a strong hero, because just like the other heroes give heal, like Warlock and Dazzle, and Ogre gives, like, you know, that bolster with Bloodlust and just a strong body, Crystal Maiden gives aura, which simply gives their heroes more mana to use in lane, which is really nice. But what Clockwork offers is he's a hero that, when picked in the first round like this, is a very strong support, something we've seen a lot of teams utilize, but he can also be an offlaner. So what he enables in this patch is, if he has a good lane, or it enables basically saying, if we have our third or fourth pick, and we see a sick offlaner or a sick support hero that just counters the enemy team, then we can switch Clockwork accordingly. If we have a sick support to counter something they're doing, we're going to move them to offlane. If we have a sick offlaner to counter their lane and just win our laning stage, we're going to move them to support. And that's what you're going to see them doing in this draft, and I think is going to be super important in this patch, is just to have versatility in your first couple picks that allow you to adjust to better lanes, basically. And one thing nice about Clockwork is he basically forces an SF ban because of the way that Clockwork's cogs and souls work at the beginning of the game. He basically forces an SF ban, so it's a very nice perk that Clockwork will offer as well. So what I love about Ursa here is they third pick Ursa, and basically what it takes to counter Ursa in lane is having more stuns and like being able to lock him down and kite him in the lane. So like if you have an aggressive core and 2 stuns, that deals really well with Ursa. Having 2 supports that lock him down while the enemy core does damage. That's generally how you deal with Ursa. But in this case, Newbie's already revealed one of their supports in the Jakiro, who is mainly attack slows, and Ursa has overpower to counter that. So that makes Ursa automatically going to have a good lane, and that allows them to pick him third here. Because I said there's so many requirements to counter Ursa in lane, basically what I said is 2 supports with stuns and a core that does damage. That just makes it much easier to pick Ursa. So they even picked the Weaver as a core that deals damage against Ursa, and they try to get that lane matchup, but because they don't have the stuns to go with the Weaver, it doesn't mean that Weaver's going to win the lane. And here you see the Clockwork pick coming into effect. They see Burrow Strike from Sand King, and they see Weaver. Basically, the hardest counter to Weaver in the game in the support role is Rubik, because of the instant stun, the ability to break Lincolns and stun him, as well as the fact that Sakuchi is like one of the most powerful abilities in the game to steal. So then Newbie, in my opinion, makes a massive draft error. They pick Tidehunter. Not only is he a weak matchup in lane against Ursa, he doesn't necessarily crush Clockwork, but they also have a Rubik to steal Ravage. So all that combined, I think that this was a major draft error. But the reason why I love Ursa here is because he's enabled by Crystal Maiden, a hero that I think is one of the best synergies with Ursa, and he's just going to have a good lane, period. And their timing is going to be based on Ursa. And what generally happens, and something I'll be talking about more with Ursa in the video that will be a replay analysis of this game, is that he enables other cores. And we talked about that earlier in this video. But what basically happens is Ursa does one of 2 things. One, he requires so much attention in lane that one of your other lanes snowballs out of control. We saw that in the Ursa Tinker game for Liquid. The other option is that he has such a good start that one of your other cores, usually your mid laner, will eventually be able to utilize the space that the Ursa provides to become the highest net worth in the game. The reason why this occurs is because Ursa's so strong in lane and really good at forcing Roche. but he doesn't farm very fast. So generally speaking, what happens with Ursa is he either starts at the top net worth and then becomes second highest net worth, or is the second highest net worth on his team. Even though he's a carry, he generally becomes the 2 position in terms of farm because he just enables his other cores and he himself does not flash farm past the early stages of the game. So basically, what we talked about needing in drafts, in this patch especially, is push. You need objective forcing. So when you look at Vega Squadron's into their draft, they see that they have a Queen of Pain against them in the mid lane, and they have the last pick. And so with Ursa Clockwork as your 2 cores and 2 supports that don't necessarily push, you need a hero that takes objectives. And I talked about, what's their timing based off of? Well, if you get Ursa at a good start in this game, he's just going to make space for the mid laner. So they're not necessarily concerned about their mid laner having a good start, drafting for the lane. Their mid laner simply needs to fill the void of their draft, which is pushing. So their options were heroes like Death Prophet, in this case Dragon Knight, and just heroes that push, high physical damage. SF was banned, heroes that offer that push. And since SF was banned, and they didn't want to go with Death Prophet in this case, that's more of like a long cooldown ultimate when they have a bunch of 4 low cooldown heroes, and even though DK has an ultimate, he's much more useful outside of it than a hero like Death Prophet is, because he has the lockdown and the nuke. That DK is just a good hero for falling behind in lane and still doing his job against a snowballing mid hero on the enemy team, meaning like they're probably going to lose their mid lane, and then they have the enabling of the Dragon Knight through the course of Ursa's good start. So you're basically going to see that this game, flash forwarding through the lanes, going to be a high contest in the top lane. We even adjusted the Ursa going to the top lane to avoid this aggro tri lane coming out from newbie. They went with the Sand King Jakiro Weaver lane to deal with Ursa, and because I talked about how important Ursa's timing was and him having the good start, they actually moved the Ursa into the Tidehunter's lane, which is a good matchup for Ursa. And when you fast forward, past the laning stage, when you look at the net worths, we're going to see that Ursa's the #1 net worth. And that's just because he had a good laning matchup, and we talked about that in the draft. You saw their plan. You saw they played the Crystal Maiden and Rubik heavily around the top half of the map, let the Clockwork pretty much be treated as an offlaner in the safe lane, and their DK, who, even though he had a rough time in his lane, he died a couple times. 3 times to be exact. He's still not doing that bad in net worth because the enemy team's spending so much time and effort dealing with Ursa. And so basically what this turns into is a timing where they get the first Aegis with the Ursa, Vlad's, same build that Matumba Man went for, the Vlad's into the Blink. And then the second Aegis timing, because that's generally Ursa's timing is always around Roche's. This patch, what makes Ursa so much better, and what we're going to see here, is that the second Aegis now gives cheese. So when we fast forward to the push coming out from Vega Squadron with the second Aegis, you're going to see the impact that the second cheese has. So as compared to last patch, having no cheese at this point would make what's about to happen virtually impossible. But that being with Ursa having the early force Roches, Dragon Knight now has a cheese, and he's their base sieger. And while Dragon Knight's a very poor Aegis carrier because he doesn't persist his ult through the Aegis loss, he's a great cheese carrier because he's hard to burst down, and he's a very durable frontliner that kills buildings. So you're going to see that they've already used the Aegis to take the tier 3. They've traded the Aegis for the tier 3, and they still have the cheese on Dragon Knight. And you're going to see the massive effect that it has here. They try to burst him, he barely lives, gets the cheese off. This push literally would not happen if Vega Squadron did not have the cheese. So that is showing the massive impact that giving the second Roche a cheese has on 7.06. And this ends up turning into a racks for them and inevitably the game. Yeah, they have the 2 high net worth, something I talked about at the beginning of this game, and if you look at every Ursa game, it pretty much turns out this way. Ursa is the second highest net worth, even though he had a much better start than the DK because of what we've talked about with Ursa. And then they're able to get that first lane of racks and just really secure their map control because of that cheese. And just another major impact on the drafting as well as the strategy that you should be looking at in 7.06. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, just like impressions with examples of how drafting should go and what you should be looking out for in your pubs. To really wrap it up, I just want to say that I believe if you're a support, really look to protect mid lane or safe lane based on what hero you think's timing is more important on your team as well as the enemy team, meaning like maybe if you help your team shut down the enemy offlaner, it's more important, that kind of decision. And if you're a carry or just a core player in general, really think about the need to be able to force objectives. And if you have a hero like Bristle or a lone druid, make sure your timings line up with theirs. And if you have a hero like Ursa or something else like that that doesn't offer tower push and you need that objective push, to make sure you wrap up your draft in pubs with that kind of pick. And even though this isn't pro Dota and people don't hit timings perfectly like we're seeing with these teams, it still is important to fill these holes. And even though these holes always exist, meaning that it's always important to try to have a building hitter, I think that being able to force objectives this patch is even more important than it was in the previous patches. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I'll be seeing you guys in my next video.